You've seen Napoleon Bonaparte as a brilliant strategist, a lion on the battlefield, but few know the rituals he wove around his power, rituals that some say summoned forces darker than mere superstition. In the cold dawns before battle, Napoleon rose before his generals. He dressed with meticulous ceremony, uniform perfectly pressed, boots polished to a mirror sheen, every metal aligned at precise angles. Then came the true performance. He would pace the tent alone, repeating a litany of numbers, dates, and Latin phrases he believed traced the ancestral bloodline of his greatness. On June 14, 1800, before Marengo, he spent nearly an hour whispering the date of his birth backward and forward, convinced that mirroring time itself would bend fate to his will. Officers waiting outside heard him chant, 18, Thermidor, and 9. 9, and Thermidor, 18, until the last syllable wavered on his lips. Only then would he permit himself to don the bicorn hat and ride out to meet his destiny. Witnesses swore his eyes glowed with unnatural intensity, part zeal, part obsession, like a man convinced that his own rituals kept the world from fracturing beneath him. But his behavior grew stranger. In the heat of campaign, he demanded that his physicians trace the pulsing of his carotid artery with a silver-filigree stethoscope he had commissioned himself, convinced that the quality of his heartbeat foretold victory. At Austerlitz, he refused to enter the council tent until a pair of twin candles burned with identical flames, one in each candelabra. Generals who snapped a candle too early were banished to the back rows, stripped of counsel and honor, until they begged forgiveness at his feet. Then there was the ritual of the glove. Each morning, he placed a white, satin-lined glove on the map table, over the site where he planned to strike. He'd stroke its surface, feeling the silk under his fingers, and murmur the name of the river or village he intended to assault. If his troop movements later faltered, he'd tear the glove in two across the wrist and toss the halves into the fire, convinced that destroying his own emblem would draw new luck. Troops learned to fear these ceremonies almost as much as they feared his cannon fire. One morning in 1806, before Jena, his aide-de-camp lost one of the ritual candles. Napoleon stopped mid-review, eyes flashing. He withdrew his saber and swung it against the chapel door, sending a crack up the woodwork. "Order!" he snapped. When the flame falters, so too does the soul of conquest. Soldiers said afterward that the echo of steel on oak carried farther than any drum roll. But by 1812, amid the desolation of the Russian winter, the rituals became darker still. Napoleon collected shards of 6 broken spires from the churches his armies had shelled. He bound them together with silver wire into a crude scepter, which he held aloft before battle, declaring it a spear of destiny. You can imagine the shock when, at Smolensk, he lifted that makeshift staff and shouted, "Today, I command time itself." And in that moment, a freak storm of hail and snow descended. Soldiers swore they'd never seen weather obey a man so directly. Yet it was his nightly ritual that truly fractured his sanity. Each evening, he would return to the same tent, no matter which campaign, and place 3 mugs of wine in a perfect row. One for courage, one for wisdom, one for ruthlessness. He'd taste them in order, red, white, port, never letting a single drop spill. Then, he'd call for a drumbeat, a single, slow beat, 5 seconds apart. At each beat, he tapped the hilt of his sword, whispering the name of a fallen comrade, always counting down from 10. On the final count, he closed his eyes and fell silent for a full minute, eyes facing the heavens. Officers speculated that this was not prayer but something else, a call to unseen forces. Many claimed that a faint, rhythmic pulse seemed to answer his drumbeats, emanating from the ground below. Some swore the tents themselves creaked in response, as if objects made of wood and cloth were straining under the weight of his will. By 1814, when Allied armies rolled toward Paris, whispers of Napoleon's rituals spread into rumor. They said he'd developed a final rite, a ceremony of slaughter, where he sacrificed a captured standard, burning it in a brazier lit by a single match struck on his saber. He believed that spilling the enemy's colors to flame would steal their courage. Yet when he tried it at Fontainebleau, the blaze turned blue and black, and a scream, half human, half wind, rose from the ashes. Troops scattered, convinced the staff had summoned something not of this world. Legend holds that on his final night in the Tuileries, Napoleon wrote a cryptic note. "The ceremonies bind me as tightly as they free me. In seeking dominion over fate, I have become its prisoner." The next morning, he awoke to find the halls silent, the candles unlit, his life's rituals shattered by defeat. He left behind his gloves, his scepter, and a silver goblet broken in three. So when you think of Napoleon's legacy, remember the man beyond the battlefield, the man who bent rituals into weapons. Rituals born of genius, honed into obsession, and ultimately turned back upon their master. Because there is a thin line between calling on destiny and being devoured by it, and Napoleon danced upon that line with all the force of an empire at his command.